Chapter 6, A Reassuring Hissing Sound. That evening things began to happen in preparation for the next day. The holiday was definitely over. To start with, I was given a pre-medication injection Sunday night around 8 p.m. Not long after that, a priest dropped by to give me an anointing in the Catholic tradition and to say a prayer with me. I was wearing a green scapular, something worn in Catholic tradition for good health and safekeeping by the angels and saints. The priest too blessed this. After he left, I got quiet. It was as if my body knew it was time to prepare. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized I was going somewhere tomorrow, carried by strangers to a strange place. I wondered if everything would be here when I got back. Drifting in, drifting out. At 6:30 a.m. the next morning, Monday the 8th of August, I was given another injection to sedate me. I remember trying to talk with slurry speech. At 7:30 a.m. I was placed on a trolley and transported to a section of the hospital known as the Page Chest Pavilion. It was where heart and lung surgeries were conducted. Somewhat scary, it seemed like I had left one world for another. I was transported through a tunnel that crossed under Missenden Road to the operating theatre in Page. As blurry as things were at the time, I still remember being spoken to by the anaesthetist. Something about counting to 20. I think I may have got to 10. All I can tell you about the surgery is what they told me later. The procedure took 4 hours to complete and my heart had stopped beating 4 times following the surgery. That little piece of information would only come to light much later from Dr. Nix in the follow-up consultation. What the world got up to over the next 3 days, I have no idea. I still don't. My world was an oxygen tent. Icy and eerie, interrupted with an incessant but reassuring hissing sound of the life-giving oxygen. Ice was packed into my pillow to keep my temperature down and reduce the chance of fever or infection developing. Occasionally I could hear voices. I drifted in and out of the world during those 3 days. The hissing sound told me I was still in the land of the living. The voices just faded in and out. It wasn't until late on the 3rd day, I began to realize they were the voices of the nurses. They apparently spoke to me continuously, as if to coax me out of unconsciousness and to check on my responsiveness. Eventually they had their way. On the 4th day after the operation I began to recover something close to full awareness. But I would remain in intensive care until late on Thursday 11th. Getting in touch. 1958, so there were no mobile phones. No SMS, no emails, to communicate with faraway family and friends. Only letters or telegrams or long-distance phone calls, the cost of which for my family was something of a luxury. Not that we even had a phone. Many families in Australia relied on the good grace of someone local who had managed to have one installed. Communications back to Rothay Road took on something of a military operation. On returning from the hospital each day, an update on my condition was phoned through by Mum or Dad. This was done via a neighbour of my grandmother's, Mrs. Lacey, who had a phone. The call was put through to Mrs. Myers, who lived nearby to us in Rothay Road. The information was then relayed on foot to the Ryan household. My parents took turns to visit during those crucial days while I was in intensive care. Those days were the most worrisome. Having only just survived the operation, the doctors and nurses were now fully focused on recovery. Even I knew, as I drifted in and out of consciousness, that I was not out of the woods. The waiting, as they say, is the hardest part. So it was late on Thursday afternoon Dr. Nix declared that the worst of it was over. It was time for me to return to the world. So I was wheeled back to the ward. Sadly not my D1 ward, but the recovery ward on the 8th floor of the Page Chest Pavilion. My 2 sisters Joy and Veronica arrived that very afternoon. They had no idea what to expect. Even Mum and Dad were a little apprehensive as to my condition. Would I have problems speaking or moving? Would I remember who in fact they were? Would I be in pain? There was really only one way to find out. The ward sister in charge that afternoon greeted Joy and Veronica before entering the ward and informed them of the very news they wanted to hear. It being, I was out of the oxygen tent and expected to make a full recovery. They also firmly requested that they keep the visit short and try not to get me too excited. Mum and Dad, who had arrived shortly after, knew the drill from the 3 days before. But in the emotion of the moment, everything changed. Whatever bad news they had imagined was immediately swept away by relief. All four began to tear up. What they experienced at that moment they would tell me again and again, as if the words allowed them to relive the lifting of the burden. It was as though when later telling me, they had been holding their breath for over a week. When they finally composed themselves and made their way to my bedside, they were only 3. As pleased as I was to see them, and yes, more than a little excited, I was perplexed. "Where's Daddy?" I asked Mum. She tried to explain but soon became teary. "Dad," she said, "would be along shortly." The weight of my father's burden had overcome him on hearing the news. News he may have suspected he would never hear about his youngest son. Even now I am not really sure as to what he really felt at that moment, or what he had been going through privately. Although we spoke about it later, he was always wisecracking and jovial about it. But as to his true feelings, I suspect only Mum really knew. What had really happened was that Dad had been so overcome with joy and relief at the news of my recovery, he needed to turn away and take a walk. He just needed time for it all to sink in, to gather his thoughts, his emotions, composing himself before seeing the face of the son he might not have ever seen again. When he did come in, he looked a little upset, but in a good way. Even now when I think of that moment and I can see their faces, I get a small lump in my throat as I feel their emotions all over again. While not out of those woods, I had made it through the worst and most perilous part of the operation. So we had a little bit of celebration at my bedside with the couple of small gifts they had brought me. But seeing them and them being able to see me was what our little time together was all about. There's nothing like family at a time like that to put a smile on your dial. All the while my healing heart continued to beat. Dr. Nix said to my mother after the operation, "We nearly lost him. Your faith saved him. We believe he has been saved for a good purpose." Mum never said anything about this, until a good deal of time later. I didn't know what to make of it at the time, but now I see it as Dr. Nick's healing touch. His way of reaching out to the family who he knew would now carry on his work. That's what angels do, they reach out. No pain, no gain. For 6 weeks after my surgery I was kept in hospital for what was termed bed rest with follow-up inspections by student doctors and other medical staff. Today bed rest is almost a thing of the past. A former neighbor of mine whose young son at 9 years of age had a similar surgical procedure to me, was in and out of hospital in 7 days. All he lives with is with a surgical hairline scar from his throat to the bottom of his sternum. Whereas I carry a scar from armpit to armpit, stitched in surgery with 45 sutures. Plus a blood transfusion incision in my left groin requiring 4 sutures. I'm not complaining, because I have been able to live life, enjoying it to the fullest. Now in my 70s, I am immensely grateful. However, this was 1958 and bed rest was front and center after major surgery. Every morning the nurses assisted me out of bed so they could refresh my bed before a visiting physiotherapist walked me around. This included breathing exercises, which for my new heart was a vital part of the daily routine. I was kept in bed for the first week and soon found it boring and unstimulating. I spent each day sitting there with the other patients, mainly older men, in the recreation room. It did, however, have a city outlook. With each day it became a little more mesmerizing. I would always find something that I hadn't seen the day before. Coloring in was my assigned therapy. But despite the view and the supply of pencils and books, I was soon at my wit's end. So I put in a request to be returned to the exciting D1 ward. This they allowed me to do a week later. I was subsequently transferred back to the veranda bed to resume my explorations and my observations of the planes descending across the skyline. Something, no doubt, they had continued to do in my absence. Once again, I could talk to other patients and go for walks. The men's ward was uninteresting to me, as I really couldn't strike up conversations with most of them there. Many were in traction from very serious injuries, uncomfortable and wanting to be left alone. However, I did make friends with a few. One in particular was a returned World War II veteran. He used to get a large number of male visitors who I later found out were army buddies of his in the Second World War, fighting in the desert against the Germans at places like El Alamein, before returning to defend Australia from the Japanese in New Guinea. But the person who would light up the ward was the French cleaning lady who used to make me laugh when talking to the men patients. She would reply to them with a phrase "ooh la la, zexta zexty." Or that's how it sounded to me. I thought this hilarious. It also made other men in the ward laugh when hearing me giggle and say it. A nurse I really got along with told me the words were, "ooh la la, sexy sexy." As an innocent, mostly good young Catholic boy, I'd never heard of the word sexy. So it didn't have a lot of relevance. That would come later. But she was fun to be around when she came into the ward to clean. Did a good job too. The ward as well as our spirits was always refreshed by her presence. Dried tea leaves she would spread on the wooden floor and then mopped off and buffed with a dry mop electric polisher. The floor always gleamed. But it wasn't all orange juice and Skittles. There was the dreaded OBS trolley. It had a rusty squeaky sound, which carried with it the portents of doom. And in the weeks following my surgery I became attuned to its ominous rattly squeak. Sometimes it would come for me. And when it did, it brought with it a large penicillin syringe. I knew the drill. Up on your bed, down with your pants, lie on your side, close your eyes and think of Wollongong, or something. It would mean I had to lay on my side as the head of the syringe was first inserted by the nurse in a buttock cheek. Then the rest of the glass syringe was gently screwed into place before you felt the serum diffuse into your body. All the while with the nurse pressing on the head of the syringe. Sometimes I'd yell out with the pain. Sometimes not so much. The sting of the penicillin and streptomycin is something you never quite forget. No pain, no gain. But a pain in my butt nonetheless. I spent more time in the women's ward where they seemed to like me. On some occasions they'd take me walking with them to the shop about 5 minutes walk from the ward. My father had given me some pocket money on a weekend visit. I remember buying a bottle of Cotti's Passiona, a new passion fruit flavored soft drink. It became something of a favorite of mine. A lasting memory of D1 was a woman friend I made named Helen Booty. I would visit her and talk to her quietly in the women's ward. She had gynecological problems. Not that I had any awareness of such things. A woman in her mid-20s, she welcomed my talking with her. I asked if she would be my friend. She agreed on the condition she could call me Pip. That sounded cute, so I agreed. Pip I would be. Then prior to me being released from RPA, Helen was also released from care, going home to where she lived with her caring sister Joan. Before leaving, I asked Helen if we could be pen friends. Pen friends or pen pals were a popular means of connecting with people and keeping friendships alive in those days. No Skype, no Facebook then. Helen thought this was a great idea, and up until I turned 20 we regularly wrote to each other. Once after she married, she and her husband John came to visit me in Wollongong. While visiting, Helen informed me she was expecting a baby and would be moving to Queensland. Her sister Joan passed away when I was 15. Helen continued to write, though eventually we lost touch. She probably didn't have time as a mother of 2 children. Nonetheless, a remarkable lady and wonderful friend for an 8-year-old to have far from home. Another time, another hospital. RPA was a turning point in my life. Little did I know that another hospital, only a few miles to the east and 20 years on, would provide the next great turning point in my life. My story would shift from the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital Camperdown to Prince of Wales Randwick. 2 very different times, 2 very different places, and I would learn in the hardest way you can, just what my father and mother went through with me. Family snapshots, brothers Peter and John. My brother Peter was of a slight build and a little on the short side. But like my brother Kevin, he turned it to advantage. He also borrowed from his older brother Bill the notion that travel brought you education and opportunity. Peter and his younger brother Patrick didn't just borrow it, they invested in it. And more than once. Peter started life working for a local dry cleaner and was still there in 1954 at the age of 16 when fate took a hand. His boss, who had racing connections, advised him to try his hand at becoming a jockey. So a door opened. Through connections, Pete moved to New Zealand, the home of many a Melbourne Cup winner, to take up an apprenticeship as a jockey. He briefly returned the year I had my heart surgery in 1958, before going back to complete his training. And he won some races too, including the Ellerslie Cup in the early 1960s. On the back of that, pardon the pun, he returned to race at Randwick in Sydney against some of the great jockeys of the day. George Moore, Athol Mully, Ray Selkrig, and the like. But fate intervened again. Tiring of the racing game and all its demands and its backroom boys, he returned to Wollongong to start at Australia Iron and Steel at Port Kembla in the Time Office. Returning to TAFE, he completed his accountancy qualification, and it wasn't long before he started his own business, a milk run. Remembering back then, milk was delivered to your door every day. It was as much a business as it was a service. And Peter never looked back. I know this as I was one of his part-time employees while I was at high school. The thing about Pete was his thirst for knowledge and to improve himself. Even in his declining years, he never tired of learning. An incredibly fit man, for years he competed in the annual City Surf race in Sydney, at times finishing in the top 100. The same for local events. Even today I can see him jogging down the Prince's Highway in the early morning before going to work. He passed away after a long illness in 2025. John Ryan was number 6 in the batting order of the Ryan 11, the fourth of 7 brothers. He was 12 years of age in 1955. Always the prankster and joker, with a great sense of fun and mischief, he was both a joy and a danger to be around. It marked him in the best way amongst my brothers. Sadly, it would mark him out in the worst way in the eyes of another set of brothers, at the local Christian Brothers School. Where we saw the angel, they only saw the devil. More than anyone else in my family, John endured the bastardry of the Catholic school system of the day. But more than anyone else in my family, he gave it back in spades. For John had 2 things in abundance that many in the church didn't: character and generosity. At the age of 15, and despite being stymied by 2 or 3 marks in his final school exams, he immediately went out and trained for and achieved his bronze medallion for surf life saving, which included on the day, an arduous swim and rescue. He started working odd jobs around the district before moving into a traineeship in mine management. Along the way, he also bought and operated a bread run. Bread like milk was home delivered back then. In 1962, he met the love of his life, a beautiful lady, Frances. They went on to establish a property, a family of 2, a construction business and an opal mine in the northwest of the state for good measure. John and Frances gave generously from their back pocket, their small farm and of their time to those in need as well as the local church. A black belt in the martial arts, John got his own back on the notorious brother who beat him at school. But that's another story. John also bought and mined at one time an opal mine at Lightning Ridge. Something that would have been truly out of the ordinary for most of us. But not John. He bought it, mined it, and even turned a profit on it before selling it. I should know, I was employed, for want of a better word, for a short time, down in the mine chipping away for those elusive little gems. He was a terrific brother, friend, and father who passed away all too early, succumbing to complications from the removal of a brain tumor, which ironically was benign.